He was a cold billionaire and hardly knew his daughter. But one student, who was working part-time for him, did what neither doctors nor money could do. See how her actions changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The mansion stood tall and quiet, its windows gleaming with a cold brilliance against the early morning sun. Inside, polished marble floors reflected light in lifeless patterns, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the air system and the occasional echo of footsteps from a housekeeper making her rounds. It was a home filled with wealth, with art collected from around the world, with books lined up in towering shelves, and yet it carried an air of emptiness that no ornament could disguise. This was the residence of Michael Reynolds, one of the wealthiest men in America, a man who had built his empire brick by brick through sheer determination, calculated risk, and an unrelenting pursuit of success. To the world, he was the embodiment of power, respected, feared, and admired in equal measure. But behind the closed doors of his palatial home, his life had long since hollowed out. Michael had lost his wife 3 years ago, an unexpected illness taking her away too soon, leaving behind him and their only child. Since that day, work had consumed him entirely. His boardroom became his sanctuary, the constant drone of numbers and projections his means of numbing the grief he refused to face. Colleagues saw him as sharper, more ruthless than ever. Yet few realized that his long hours and endless projects were less about ambition and more about escape. He had become a shadow of the man he once was, retreating from any warmth that might remind him of what he had lost. In the center of this vast silence lived his daughter, Ava. She was 7 years old, fragile in body but not in spirit, a girl whose illness had marked her life since birth. Her joints and legs ached with every step she took, turning even simple movements into painful challenges. The long staircases of the mansion, the sprawling hallways, the large echoing rooms, each of them reminded her of how small and vulnerable she truly was. The world had given her wealth in abundance, tutors who came and went with precise schedules, doctors who checked her progress with clinical detachment, and caretakers who fulfilled their duties with professionalism. But none of these things brought her what she longed for most. She had everything and nothing at the same time. Ava's days blended into one another. She would wake to the quiet shuffle of a nurse preparing her medication, attend lessons at a small desk in her room with a tutor who spoke too quickly, endure therapy sessions that felt more like punishments than care, and retreat into her books or toys in solitude when the staff disappeared. There were no siblings to share secrets with, no mother to comfort her when the pain grew too heavy, and a father who seemed more like a distant figure than a presence in her life. At night, she often stared at the ceiling, wondering why her world felt so big and empty, why all the voices around her sounded polite but never warm. Yet within the monotony of her existence, there was a spark of hope that kept her waiting and watching. Every week, she would take a marker and draw a small heart on the Saturday square of her calendar. Saturday meant Jade. Jade Williams, the young woman who had become the one bright light in her quiet world, was not a nurse, not a tutor, and not a family member. She was a student who came to the house on weekends, stepping in for her aunt, who was one of the household maids. Jade was 23 years old, a dark-skinned girl with eyes that seemed to hold both tiredness and determination. She came from a modest background, living with her family in a far less glamorous neighborhood. To make ends meet, she balanced her medical studies with multiple jobs, and one of those jobs happened to be filling in as a housekeeper when her aunt could not. For Jade, this work was not a career but a necessity, a way to pay tuition, to support her younger siblings, to keep her household afloat. But to Ava, Jade was not just another maid. From the first time she entered the mansion, carrying with her the faint scent of bus rides and the energy of someone who did not yet see walls as barriers, Ava sensed something different. Unlike the other adults, Jade didn't look at her as though she were fragile porcelain about to break. She didn't rush her through her words, didn't pity her condition, and never treated her illness as the only thing that defined her. Instead, Jade talked to her like she mattered. She played small games, asked about her drawings, listened when Ava wanted to share, and even found gentle ways to help her exercise without it feeling like a chore. It was in these small moments that Ava felt alive. During the week, she counted the hours until Jade's arrival. She would sit by the window, clutching a small stuffed bear, her eyes fixed on the driveway where eventually a modest figure would appear, stepping out with determination in her stride. Ava would beam, her cheeks lighting up with the kind of smile that had grown rare in her life. Saturdays became the axis on which her world spun. Michael, of course, hardly noticed. His mornings started before dawn, with suits laid out by the valet, breakfast eaten quickly as he scanned through emails on his tablet, and departures timed precisely to avoid traffic. By the time Jade arrived, he was already gone, submerged in meetings, negotiations, and decisions. For him, Jade was no different from the other rotating faces in his household staff. She was an anonymous figure moving through the hallways, fulfilling her duties and disappearing when her hours were done. He paid little attention to her name, her presence, or her impact on his daughter. Yet there were things he could not ignore forever. Occasionally, when he returned home earlier than usual, he would hear something he had not expected. Laughter. Ava's voice, once quiet and hesitant, would ring down the hallways with unrestrained joy. It startled him the first time he heard it, almost as though it came from a memory rather than the present. He would pause in the entryway, listening as Jade's voice joined in, light and encouraging, filling the air with warmth he hadn't realized his home lacked. But instead of entering, he often retreated to his study, telling himself that it was good his daughter had found some amusement. He buried the unease that came with recognizing how little of that joy had ever come from him. The staff noticed the change long before he did. They whispered among themselves about how Ava smiled more easily on weekends, how her eyes followed Jade wherever she went, how the girl seemed transformed by the presence of someone who treated her like more than just a patient. Even the house itself seemed to respond. The kitchen became livelier, the corridors echoed with sound, and the oppressive stillness lifted, if only for 2 days each week. But for Ava, these were not temporary distractions. They were lifelines. She lived for the moments when Jade would kneel beside her, gently encourage her to try standing a little longer, or weave stories into the tedious stretches that usually felt unbearable. She treasured the times Jade told her about her own studies, about the world outside the mansion, about the idea of helping people not just with medicine, but with kindness. Each visit added another layer of hope to Ava's small world, convincing her that perhaps her future did not have to be limited by her illness. And so the weeks turned into months. Every Saturday, Ava's calendar filled with hearts, each one representing not just the presence of a visitor, but the presence of someone who made her feel alive. For her, Jade was not a maid, not a temporary worker, but the center of her universe. She dreamed of growing stronger, not for her father, not for the doctors, but for Jade, who believed in her when no one else seemed to. Michael remained unaware of just how deeply this bond had taken root. His empire grew larger, his name carried further, but the true transformation, the one happening under his own roof, remained unseen. At least for now. For while Michael's heart remained locked in ice, while Ava's fragile hope clung to weekends, and while Jade's weary determination carried her through the grind of her studies and work, the stage was being set for a shift none of them could yet imagine. The house that once knew only silence was beginning to remember what it meant to breathe. And though Michael did not yet know it, he would soon be unable to ignore the change that had quietly, persistently taken root in the very center of his life. The weeks continued to move forward, each one blending into the next with a rhythm that Ava had learned to endure. Yet the weekends remained sacred to her, the moments when the monotony of endless lessons and treatments gave way to something far brighter. When Saturday morning arrived, she woke earlier than usual, her eyes wide with anticipation. She would sit by the tall window of her room, a small smile tugging at her lips as she waited for the figure she adored. The mansion was vast and imposing, but when Jade stepped through the front doors with her modest bag over her shoulder, everything seemed to change. It began subtly. The girl's presence carried a kind of energy that slipped into the air and transformed it. Where silence had once dominated, the sound of laughter now emerged, soft at first and then louder, until it spilled through the corridors and reached even the distant study where Michael often worked during his rare hours at home. For Ava, these were the moments she lived for. Jade brought with her not only companionship, but also the promise of discovery, of growth, of small victories against the frailty that bound her. Jade never came with the cold detachment of a professional. She treated Ava like a friend, like a child worthy of joy, rather than an endless list of restrictions. She devised small games that seemed nothing more than play, but were carefully chosen to help strengthen Ava's fragile joints. A ball rolled across the carpet was not only a source of amusement, but also a chance for the girl to stretch her limbs. Steps up a short staircase became part of an adventure. Each movement transformed into a challenge that Ava wanted to conquer rather than avoid. Jade's imagination gave color to the monotony, disguising therapy as play, and Ava responded with determination that no doctor had been able to inspire. The change was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. Slowly, Ava began to look less at the floor and more toward her goals. Her eyes lit with pride when she managed to hold her balance longer than the last time, when she climbed one more step, when she pushed through the discomfort for the sake of proving herself capable. Each achievement was small in the eyes of the world, but monumental to her. For the first time, she felt she was not only surviving her condition, but fighting against it, with someone by her side who believed she could win. Even more important than the progress was the laughter. It rang through the halls of the Reynolds mansion like a forgotten melody rediscovered. Staff members paused in their duties to listen, smiling quietly to themselves, for they too noticed the shift. The house no longer seemed so oppressive on weekends. The air felt lighter, the rooms warmer, as though Jade's presence had unlocked a door that had been closed since the day Ava's mother died. Michael noticed it as well, though he tried not to admit it at first. He was a man who lived by numbers, by goals and deadlines, by the language of profit and loss. His daughter's laughter was not something he could measure, and so he treated it as background noise, a pleasant distraction that required no attention. Yet there were moments when he could not ignore it. Once, returning home earlier than expected, he stepped into the entryway and froze as he heard Ava's delighted shrieks echo from the living room. He stood there listening as Jade's voice answered with encouragement, and something stirred in him that he had not felt in years. He did not enter the room, choosing instead to retreat to his study, but the sound stayed with him long into the night, unsettling his carefully built walls of detachment. Ava, meanwhile, blossomed. Her fear of trying new things began to fade under Jade's guidance. She started to talk more, sharing stories of her day, dreams of what she might do if her legs were stronger, hopes that once seemed too far away to mention. Jade listened to everything with patience and sincerity, never dismissing her thoughts, never making her feel small. This gave Ava a sense of worth that she had rarely experienced before. She was no longer just a child with an illness. She was Ava, with ideas, ambitions, and laughter that filled the house like sunlight. The bond between the two grew stronger with every visit. Ava counted the days between Jade's appearances, marking each one off on her calendar, her excitement growing as the weekend drew near. She even began to prepare small surprises, drawings she wanted to show, stories she wanted to tell, little victories in her exercises that she saved to reveal only when Jade was there to witness them. The anticipation gave her strength, pulling her through the long and dull weekdays until Saturday returned once more. Michael's awareness of this bond deepened gradually. He found himself observing more closely, standing at the edge of rooms while pretending to check his phone, just to watch the way his daughter's face lit up in Jade's presence. He saw the way Ava's body seemed to forget its limitations when she was encouraged, how determination replaced hesitation, how joy replaced fear. And as he watched, a quiet unease crept into his heart. He realized how little of that transformation came from him. He had been so consumed by work and by his own grief that he had overlooked the very thing his daughter needed most. The house began to change in ways even he could not deny. It no longer felt like a museum of wealth, but like a place where life was returning. The kitchen filled with the scent of simple meals Jade helped prepare for Ava, food that carried not extravagance but care. The garden, once left untouched, became a setting for small adventures and playful training. Even the staff seemed to walk with lighter steps, for they too felt the difference Jade brought. For Michael, the realization was uncomfortable. He had always believed that money could solve everything, that providing the best tutors, the finest doctors, and the most advanced equipment was enough. Yet here was a young woman with no wealth, no prestige, no professional title, doing more for his daughter than all his resources combined. It stirred something in him that he could not yet name, a mix of gratitude, admiration, and a dawning awareness of how far he had drifted from the role of father. He did not act on these feelings immediately, for they unsettled him. Instead, he buried himself deeper in work during the week, as though the demands of his empire could shield him from the truth. But each weekend, when the sounds of laughter returned, when Ava's progress became too clear to ignore, the weight of his absence grew heavier. He knew change was happening before his eyes, and though he resisted admitting it, he could not remain blind forever. Ava did not think about these things in such terms. For her, life was simple. Jade was her friend, her ally, her source of courage. She began to draw pictures of the three of them together, herself, her father, and Jade, though, in her drawings. Her father often stood at a distance, while Jade was always at her side. She never showed Michael these drawings, but she kept them hidden away like treasures, proof of the world she wished for. The transition was subtle but undeniable. A girl who once spent her days in silence and fear was now filled with laughter, with determination, with the joy of anticipation. A man who had built walls of grief and work around himself was beginning to feel those walls tremble, chipped away by a presence he had barely acknowledged. And a young woman, burdened with her own struggles, yet determined to pursue her dreams, had unknowingly become the thread that wove their lives into something new. The mansion itself seemed to recognize the change. Its once quiet halls now carried the sounds of life, its cold rooms warmed by small acts of kindness and joy. And though Michael still clung to his routines, he could no longer pretend not to notice. Something was happening in his home, something that went beyond wealth, beyond duty, beyond the boundaries he had set for himself. What began as weekends filled with play and laughter was slowly turning into a force of transformation. For Ava, it was the discovery of strengths she never knew she had. For Jade, it was the bond that reminded her of why she had chosen her path. And for Michael, though he could not yet admit it, it was the beginning of a journey that would shake the foundations of his carefully controlled life. And as another weekend came to an end, as Jade left once more with promises to return, Ava pressed her hand against the calendar, smiling at the heart she had drawn. She knew she would count the days again, but for the first time, she also sensed that her father was beginning to watch more closely, to listen more carefully, to stand not so far away. The change was fragile, delicate as the girl herself, but it had begun, and it would not be undone. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. The months passed, and with them came an unspoken shift in the lives of those within the Reynolds mansion. The pattern of weekends had solidified into something more profound than a routine. For Ava, they were the brightest chapters of her childhood. Moments filled with laughter, small triumphs, and a sense of belonging she had long thought impossible. For Jade, they were hours where her endless responsibilities briefly transformed into something meaningful, where she could pour her heart into helping a child who looked to her, not with pity, but with admiration. And for Michael, they became times of quiet reckoning, where the walls he had built around himself began to tremble under the weight of emotions he had refused to acknowledge for years. The bond between Ava and Jade had grown to the point where it felt unbreakable. The girl depended on her presence so fully that she counted the days between each visit with an urgency that made the weekdays almost unbearable. By Friday night, Ava's eyes sparkled with anticipation, and on Saturday mornings she was awake before dawn, her small body trembling with excitement as she waited at the window. Each arrival of Jade brought with it the promise of adventure and joy. Ava would rush forward as best she could, her hesitant steps carrying her into the embrace of the woman she now considered not only a friend, but something closer, something vital. It was as if Jade had taken on the role of sister, mentor, and protector all at once. Michael could not ignore this attachment, though it stirred complex feelings within him. At first he saw it as natural for a lonely child to cling to the one person who treated her with warmth. But over time, as Ava's eyes lit up with joy in ways they never had for him, as she confessed her fears and dreams to Jade rather than to her father, Michael began to feel the sting of inadequacy. He had believed that wealth could compensate for absence, that the best doctors and tutors could replace time he was unwilling to give. Yet here was proof, living and breathing before him, that none of it mattered compared to the simple presence of a woman who had no fortune, no status, and no claim to power. He found himself drawn more and more to observe them, standing silently at doorways, lingering near the garden, pretending to check his phone, when in truth he was listening to their voices. He witnessed the strength that Ava found in Jade's encouragement. Each laugh, each small victory, was like a revelation to him, a reminder of how distant he had become from his daughter's world. And in those moments of observation, something else began to take root within him, something that went beyond gratitude. At first he resisted naming it. He told himself it was respect for the sacrifices Jade made, admiration for the way she balanced her studies, her family duties, and the kindness she offered his daughter without expectation. He convinced himself it was the relief of seeing Ava smile again, the comfort of knowing she was no longer swallowed by silence. But the truth gnawed at him quietly, refusing to be dismissed. He felt something deeper, something that had not stirred in him since before his wife's death. It frightened him as much as it comforted him, for he had long ago buried that part of himself, convinced it would never resurface. Jade, however, remained steady in her role. She never blurred the lines between her duty and her aspirations. To her, the work at the Reynolds mansion was a temporary chapter, one of many sacrifices she had to make to keep moving toward her goal. She loved helping Ava, cherished the bond they had formed, but she never allowed herself to imagine a future within those walls. Her dream lay elsewhere, in the hospital halls she envisioned herself working in the lives of children like Ava, whom she hoped to serve as a doctor. She carried this ambition like a torch through the long nights of study, the endless bus rides, and the fatigue that weighed on her shoulders. For Ava, this reality was more difficult to face. Though Jade reassured her each week that she would return, the girl's heart grew heavy with the fear that one day she might not. Each Sunday evening, as Jade prepared to leave, Ava's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. The house grew quiet again, and the hours until the next Saturday felt unbearable. She clung desperately to the belief that Jade would always come back, but in the dark of night she whispered to herself the fears she could not voice aloud, that Jade's world might one day pull her away forever. Michael began to notice this fear in his daughter. He saw the way her mood darkened during the week, the way she grew restless and withdrawn after Jade's departure. It unsettled him deeply, for he realized how fragile Ava's happiness had become. It was balanced precariously on the presence of one person, and though that person had proven steadfast, he knew that life was unpredictable. The thought of his daughter's fragile joy shattering filled him with a sense of helplessness he despised. He confronted these feelings in silence, pacing his study late at night, staring at the city skyline through tall windows. The thoughts circled endlessly in his mind. He wanted Jade to stay, not just for Ava, though that reason alone would have been enough, but for himself as well. He longed for her presence, for the warmth she carried into his home, for the way she seemed to bridge the gap between grief and hope. The feelings he had buried for so long were breaking through, and though he fought to restrain them, he could not deny the truth any longer. Yet when he tried to imagine a future where Jade was more than a visitor, he faced an unyielding wall. He knew who she was, a young woman struggling through her studies, supporting her family, working tirelessly for a future she had already defined for herself. She was not a socialite who could be dazzled by wealth, not someone who could be lured into the comfort of a billionaire's mansion. Her strength came from her independence, from her unwillingness to bend her dreams to fit the expectations of others. He admired her for it even as he realized it was the very thing that might keep her from ever truly being part of his world. Jade, for her part, sensed the undercurrents but chose not to acknowledge them. She had noticed the way Michael lingered more often, the way his eyes followed her, the subtle changes in his demeanor, but she dismissed them quickly, refusing to let her mind wander into dangerous territory. She had no room for distractions, no space for romance, and certainly no interest in stepping into a life that was not hers. Her ambitions were too important, her family's needs too pressing. She knew her place in the Reynolds mansion, and she intended to keep it clear. The silent tension reached Ava as well. Children often sense what adults leave unsaid, and she began to feel the threads of something changing, though she could not name it. What she did know was her own fear that the foundation of her happiness might crumble if Jade ever left. That fear became a constant shadow in her eyes, one that Michael could no longer ignore. It was during one of these quiet moments of dread that Jade herself made a silent vow. She promised that no matter how far her studies took her, no matter how demanding her future became, she would never abandon Ava. The child had become more than a responsibility, more than a temporary presence in her life. She was a part of her heart now, a reminder of why she had chosen her path in the first place. Even if she could not remain in the mansion forever, she would always find her way back to the girl who looked at her with unwavering trust. For Michael, this unspoken promise was not enough. He wanted certainty, permanence, a guarantee that Jade would never leave them. But when he finally allowed himself to imagine asking her to stay, he confronted the truth that even his vast resources could not secure what he wanted most. Jade's independence was her strength, and he could not strip that away without destroying the very qualities that made him admire her. For perhaps the first time in his life, he faced a battle he could not win with wealth or power. The revelation came to him slowly but with clarity. If he truly wanted Jade to remain part of their lives, he could not bind her with promises or lure her with money. He had to support her in the pursuit of her dreams, even if it meant risking the possibility that she might one day walk away. And so, deep within himself, Michael made a decision that would alter not only his own path, but Ava's as well. Instead of clinging to what he feared to lose, he would choose to give. He would stand behind Jade's ambitions, no matter the cost, for the sake of his daughter, for the sake of the woman who had rekindled light in his home, and for the sake of the man he wanted to become. The house that had once been filled only with silence now stood at the edge of transformation. Ava's laughter still filled the weekends, Jade's determination still carried her through, and Michael's heart, though conflicted, had finally opened. The questions of the future hung heavy in the air, but the foundation of something new had been laid. It was no longer just about survival or routine. It was about choice, about sacrifice, and about the kind of love that demanded courage rather than control. And as another Sunday drew to a close, with Jade preparing to leave and Ava clutching her hand tightly, Michael watched them both with an ache in his chest. He knew the time was coming when he would have to act, when his silent decision would have to become more than a thought. The fragile happiness of his daughter, the fierce independence of the young woman he admired, and his own long-buried heart were all bound together now. Whatever the future held, it would demand of him something far greater than wealth. It would demand humility, respect, and the courage to support rather than command. The decision Michael had made in the quiet of his study began to take form in the days that followed. He had spent years believing that strength meant control, that the ability to dictate outcomes was the mark of his power. Yet now, as he watched his daughter's fragile joy cling to Jade's presence, as he witnessed the quiet determination in Jade's eyes when she spoke of her future, he understood that true strength would be found in letting go of his instinct to possess. Supporting rather than commanding became the measure of his resolve, though the act was entirely foreign to him. He began simply. At first it was small gestures, almost imperceptible in their design. Bills that Jade's family had struggled with suddenly disappeared. A new laptop, modest by his standards but invaluable to a student, appeared among her belongings with only a discreet note. Her commute, which had long stretched into hours of crowded bus rides, was eased when he quietly arranged for her to be driven to and from her classes on weekdays. Jade, proud and unaccustomed to charity, resisted at first, but soon she realized that these gifts were not meant to purchase her, but to remove the burdens that threatened to pull her away from the path she had chosen. It was Michael's way of saying that he believed in her, even if his words still lagged behind his actions. Ava noticed these changes too, though she did not fully understand them. What she did understand was that her father seemed different. He lingered more in the mornings, taking his coffee at the breakfast table rather than in his car. He appeared in the garden on weekends, no longer just a distant observer, but a presence who applauded her efforts when Jade encouraged her through each exercise. The child who had once spoken of her father with a quiet resignation now began to see glimmers of the man she had always longed for. Her progress reflected this shift. With Jade by her side and her father now watching more closely, Ava found a courage she had never known. She stretched her arms wider, balanced a little longer, and when she stumbled, she laughed instead of crying. Each small victory filled her with pride, and each time she glanced up to see her father's approving gaze, her heart swelled. The mansion, once a place of echoing silence, grew alive with the sound of encouragement, the rhythm of effort, and the celebration of even the smallest steps forward. For Jade, the transformation of the house was as remarkable as Ava's progress. She had walked into those halls expecting only to fill a role, to scrub floors and dust shelves in exchange for a wage that would inch her closer to her dreams. Instead, she had found herself at the heart of a family's rebirth. She carried the weight of her studies and the expectations of her own family. But within these walls, she also carried the responsibility of giving hope to a child who believed in her with absolute trust. And though she reminded herself constantly that her path would one day take her away, she could not deny that Ava had become part of her heart. Michael saw this, and his admiration deepened. He began to recognize that Jade was not only shaping his daughter's body, but her spirit, teaching her resilience through kindness, strength through patience, and joy through effort. These were lessons that no doctor or tutor had managed to impart, and he found himself humbled by the young woman's ability to succeed where he had failed. The change within him extended beyond his home. Colleagues who had long known him as a man of iron composure began to remark on subtle differences. He no longer snapped with impatience in meetings, no longer carried the same shadow of relentless fatigue. He smiled more, though the smiles were still rare, and when he excused himself early, it was not for another deal, but for something his associates could scarcely imagine, watching his daughter's exercises in the garden. The empire he had built no longer consumed him entirely. It had shifted in his eyes, becoming a means rather than an end. For the first time, his wealth seemed purposeful, not just in its accumulation, but in its ability to build something that could not be measured in numbers. The culmination of these efforts came one evening when he revealed to Jade the plan he had shaped. He had decided to establish a foundation, one dedicated to supporting children with conditions like Ava's. It would provide not only medical care, but also opportunities for families who could not afford the treatments or therapies that might change their lives. He told her that her determination had inspired him, that her influence on Ava had opened his eyes to needs far greater than his own. Jade, overwhelmed, tried to protest, insisting she had no right to claim such credit. But Michael silenced her with the quiet truth, that her presence had accomplished what all the wealth in the world had not. The weeks that followed deepened this transformation. Ava's progress continued steadily, her laughter brightening each day, her drawings filled with images, not of isolation, but of togetherness. She sketched her father beside her more often now, Jade always close, the three of them framed in gardens or sunlit rooms rather than the sterile confines of sickbeds and empty halls. To her, they had become a team, not bound by duty but by affection, each one carrying a role in her small but growing world. Michael, too, grew into his role as more than a provider. He began to read to Ava at night, to sit at her bedside as she fell asleep, to ask her about her dreams and listen to her stories without distraction. The bond that had long been neglected slowly healed, stitched together by the laughter Jade had brought back into their lives. Jade herself continued to carry the dual weight of her ambitions and her responsibilities. She studied late into the night after leaving the mansion, her textbooks heavy on her desk, her eyelids struggling to stay open. But even as exhaustion pressed upon her, she found strength in the thought of Ava's smile, in the sound of the girl's laughter, in the knowledge that her efforts had meaning beyond herself. Her dream of becoming a doctor no longer seemed distant, for she could see its reflection in the progress of the child she helped each week. There were moments of trial, moments when doubt crept in, when the whispers of high society reached her ears. Guests at charity events raised their brows at the sight of a billionaire standing beside a young maid, their voices laced with disdain. Yet Michael never flinched. When others questioned, he responded with calm certainty, declaring that Jade had given his daughter more hope than anyone else had managed. His words silenced many, though the whispers never fully disappeared. Jade bore them quietly, but the support of the man whose respect she had earned gave her strength to stand firm. The day came when Ava achieved what had once seemed impossible. It was a crisp morning, the air cool and fresh as sunlight spilled into the garden. Jade guided her gently, her hands steady at the girl's sides, as Michael watched from a few steps away. Ava took a deep breath, her face set with determination, and then she let go of her crutches. The seconds stretched long as she placed one foot forward, then another, her small body trembling but holding. 1 step, 2 steps, 3, until finally she stumbled into her father's arms, laughing and crying at once. Michael held her tightly, his chest heaving with pride and emotion. Ava's joy filled the air, and Jade, standing close by, felt tears prick her eyes. In that moment, the barriers between them dissolved. They were no longer a billionaire, a maid, and a child marked by illness. They were a family bound by love, resilience, and the miracle of hope made real. From that day, the mansion was never the same. It was no longer a monument to wealth and silence, but a home filled with laughter, with purpose, with a future that reached beyond its walls. Michael continued to support Jade in her studies, ensuring that her path to becoming a doctor was clear of obstacles. Jade continued to return each week, her promise to Ava unbroken, her bond with the child stronger than ever. And Ava, once a lonely girl who counted days with hearts on a calendar, now looked to the future with excitement, knowing that she was no longer defined by her illness, but by the love that surrounded her. The story of their lives had been rewritten, not by power or wealth alone, but by the courage to open hearts long closed, by the refusal to surrender to despair, and by the quiet strength of a young woman whose presence changed everything. In the end, the greatest fortune Michael Reynolds possessed was not his empire, but the family he had discovered anew. A family built not on circumstance, but on the enduring foundation of hope and love. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.